June 4, 1943, the Recreation Hall at Camp Hearn, Texas. Oberleutnant Herman Fischer's hand shook as his fountain pen moved across the page of his hidden journal. Every word he wrote was dangerous. Discovery would mean a beating from the SS guards, the same men who'd tormented him in Africa and now watched him even here, thousands of miles from home. The Americans had done something unexpected. They weren't showing propaganda. Real Hollywood films flickered on the screen. Actual cinema from the dream factories of California. What he'd witnessed tonight felt impossible. No nation locked in total war could produce anything like this. Yet here it was. 200 German officers from Rommel's shattered Africa Corps sat mesmerized as the projection beam cast moving images across the makeshift theater. Vivian Leigh swept across the screen. Gone with the Wind. A film about America's own civil war, their own suffering, their own rebuilding from ashes. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The spectacle overwhelmed men who'd spent 4 years absorbing Nazi ideology. The technical perfection, the orchestral music swelling at every dramatic moment, the sheer scale of production. Back in Germany, Goebbels' film studios produced black and white propaganda reels that looked primitive by comparison. Yet here, in what Berlin had always called a mongrel nation of cultural inferiors, prisoners watched a 4-hour epic that had consumed $3.85 million to make. More than Germany's entire annual film budget. 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had stepped off the passenger train just 1 day earlier. They'd arrived at this small Texas town to find the entire population turned out to watch them. Nobody understood what was about to happen. Nobody realized that this moment would spark the most surprising psychological transformation in the history of military detention. A calculated rebuilding of Nazi consciousness would take place not in interrogation rooms or through forced confessions, but in darkened theaters. American films would flicker against wooden walls, telling stories that would demolish every assumption these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and the world system they'd fought to preserve. The collapse of their worldview had already begun on May 13, 1943, in the deserts of Tunisia. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who'd taken command after Rommel's departure, surrendered along with roughly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. Rommel's legendary desert warriors, men who'd driven the British back to El Alamein, who'd earned Churchill's grudging respect, suddenly became prisoners of war. Among them was Oberleutnant Helm Richter, holder of the Knight's Cross, a veteran of campaigns in Poland and France. The journey from capture to awakening started in the transit camps scattered across North Africa. As Richter and thousands of other POWs waited for transport ships to America, American efficiency began chipping away at their certainties. But nothing could have prepared them for what waited in America's heartland. Not merely the material abundance they would witness, but the cultural sophistication of a nation they'd been taught to despise utterly. The first glimpse came aboard the Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic. Down in the enlisted men's mess, someone had set up a projector. Feldwebel Otto Kraus, captured with the 15th Panzer Division, later remembered those voyages. On the ship to America, they showed us a film. Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator. German soldiers watching a Jewish actor ridicule the Führer. Bewilderment mixed with outrage. Most of them had never seen Chaplin. His films had been banned since 1933 in Germany. Yet here, aboard an American transport ship, they watched him mock everything they'd been taught to revere. Prisoners had access to private radios and movies played 4 nights a week when the camps had facilities. If a camp lacked a projector, the men pooled their meager savings to purchase one themselves. The American military had stumbled onto something remarkable. Hollywood films proved far more effective than any propaganda lecture in showing what Americans actually valued and what they could accomplish. August 15, 1943, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. The new theater had just been completed, built entirely by the prisoners themselves. It could hold several hundred men in its seats. 25 generals were housed at Clinton, along with numerous colonels, majors, and captains. The cream of the officer corps. General Gustav von Wurst, among the highest-ranking German officers imprisoned there, stood at the rear as the lights dimmed for the inaugural screening. Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington filled the screen. It made no sense. Von Verst couldn't believe what he was watching. Here was an American film depicting corruption inside their own government. A simple man fighting against their political system. Newspapers attacking their leaders. In Germany, such a film would have meant death for everyone involved in its creation. Yet the Americans showed it to enemy prisoners. They understood that cinema worked as both entertainment and re-education, and they selected their programming carefully. Anti-Nazi Hollywood films, cartoons like Der Führer's Face, and the Why We Fight series all served their purposes. Most American films shown to prisoners dealt with the Pacific War, but the projection equipment itself fascinated the German officers. The camps used 16mm Bell and Howell projectors, machines that ran so smoothly and quietly that German technicians, men who prided themselves on mechanical perfection, spent hours examining their construction. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Becker, an engineer from Zeiss Optical Works, made notes. The precision of American projectors exceeded anything we manufactured. They operated for hours without overheating. The sound stayed perfectly synchronized to the image. We began to recognize that American technical superiority extended into every field imaginable. October 3, 1943. Camp Hearn, Texas again. The theater here had an orchestra pit where prisoners staged elaborate skits and theatrical productions. Tonight, German POWs packed the seats for a special screening. Mrs. Miniver, an MGM drama that had won Academy Awards. The film showed British resilience during the Blitz, during the bombing campaigns that had devastated their cities. Hauptmann Erich Müller, a Luftwaffe pilot who'd personally bombed London, sat in the third row. He would describe the experience afterward. We had destroyed British cities. We knew the damage we inflicted. We'd seen the photographs, yet this film portrayed British courage with such sympathy, such genuine humanity, that German soldiers found tears running down their faces for British civilians. Joseph Goebbels himself, the propaganda minister, grudgingly acknowledged the film's impact. Mrs. Miniver shows the destiny of a family during the current war, and its refined and powerful propagandistic tendency was previously only dreamed of. Not a single angry word against Germany is spoken. Nevertheless, the anti-German inclination is achieved perfectly. The film's technical brilliance astonished the German officers. Joseph Ruttenberg's cinematography, Herbert Stothart's orchestral score, the seamless editing. Every element demonstrated a level of filmmaking sophistication that German cinema couldn't match. More troubling was the emotional power it wielded. These Wehrmacht officers, many who'd participated in the bombing raids on London, discovered themselves sympathizing with British victims. Winston Churchill had said this film accomplished more for the war effort than a fleet of destroyers. The German prisoners were beginning to understand why he'd said that. November 1943 marked a shift in the film program's direction. The Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office made a controversial decision. They would begin screening Frank Capra's Why We Fight series to German POWs. The choice sparked debate. These films used captured German footage, including scenes from Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, repurposed against its creators. Academy Award winner Frank Capra, influenced and challenged by Riefenstahl's 1935 propaganda masterpiece, had crafted a direct response. His aim was to let the enemy prove to our soldiers the enormity of his cause and the justice of ours. He'd compiled enemy speeches, German films, newsreels, newspaper clippings, all connected to a catalogue of hostile Nazi actions. Camp McCain held 7,700 prisoners. Camp Clinton housed 3,400. Camp Shelby contained 5,300. At Camp McCain near Grenada, Mississippi, the first showing of Prelude to War sparked chaos. SS officers attempted to organize a boycott of the screening. The American authorities responded immediately, transferring the resistors to Camp Alva, Oklahoma, the special detention center reserved for unrepentant Nazis. Most prisoners watched anyway, transfixed by watching their own propaganda turned into evidence against them. Feldwebel Kurt Simon wrote about the experience. To see the Nuremberg rallies that had filled us with such pride presented as proof of our militaristic aggression. It was like viewing your own life through an entirely different lens. The same images, the same moments, yet everything was reversed. the series accomplished something unexpected for German POWs. It gave them context for their own nation's actions that Germans themselves had never possessed. Many prisoners had never witnessed the complete Nazi rallies. They'd never heard Hitler's full speeches. They'd never understood how their country appeared to the rest of the world. German POWs were most shocked by Hollywood's willingness to criticize America itself. In December 1943, Camp Shelby showed John Ford's The Grapes of Wrath. American poverty during the Depression. Banks and authorities criticized. Sympathy extended toward ordinary people. Everything Nazi propaganda had taught about American capitalism proved wrong. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Hoffmann, formerly a Nazi Party education officer, reflected on it. They show their own failures, their own injustices. No German film made under Hitler could depict German poverty, German suffering caused by German institutions. This self-criticism wasn't weakness. It represented strength we couldn't fathom. Camp libraries began receiving requests for John Steinbeck's novel. Within months, translation circles formed as POWs created handwritten German versions of American literature they'd discovered through these films. American camp authorities didn't forbid the activity. They encouraged it. Major Edward Davison, chief of the Special Projects Division Education Program, reported in January 1944. Prisoner consumption of American literature has increased 400% since the expanded film program commenced. They want to read the sources of the films. Gone with the Wind led to requests for books about the American Civil War. The Grapes of Wrath sparked curiosity about the Depression era. An unexpected catalyst for change arrived from Walt Disney. In February 1944, Camp Hearn began showing Disney animations before the feature films. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Pinocchio, Fantasia. German prisoners experienced sensations they'd never felt before. These weren't propaganda films, pure entertainment. Yet their influence ran deep. Hauptmann Otto Kleist observed, to witness Fantasia, this fusion of animation and classical music, Bach and Beethoven interpreted through American artistic imagination. It shattered our belief that American culture was inferior. The technical mastery, the artistic vision, the sheer creative joy on display. Our own film industry had nothing that could compete with what they showed us. Disney Studios contributed animation sequences for the Why We Fight series, certainly, but the feature-length animated films left the deepest impression on us prisoners. Many of us carried memories of children still in Germany, faces we hadn't looked upon in years. These family films struck something deeper than any propaganda ever could. The technical mastery combined with genuine emotional power created an internal conflict that no manufactured message could replicate. Working under director Werner Braun, an artist originally from Munich, I spent weeks trying to understand the Disney animation methods. The Americans were simply decades ahead of our own capabilities. If they could achieve this level of artistry with something as seemingly simple as cartoons, what other technologies might they possess? The film screenings themselves became a form of education. German prisoners were regularly assigned to run the projection equipment, which meant maintaining and operating machinery that showcased American manufacturing superiority at every level. Our camps received a steady stream of films through the Army Motion Picture Service, which distributed 16mm prints to military bases across the world. By March 1944, the distribution network could get films to prisoner camps within just 2 weeks of their theatrical release. These base camps functioned like small towns, complete with services most of us never expected to find. There were dentists and doctors, libraries stocked with books, regular film showings, education programs, athletic facilities. English language instruction was the most sought-after course. Soccer became the sport we all played whenever possible. At Camp Shelby, Helmut Wagner, who had been a projectionist at UFA Studios back in Berlin, documented this remarkable distribution system. Fresh films arrived every single week, not selections chosen by some propaganda ministry, but genuine Hollywood productions, musicals, westerns, comedies, dramas. The sheer variety amazed us. Back home in Germany, we might watch 12 different films in an entire year. Here we saw that many in just 1 month. The film stock itself held up remarkably well through countless viewings without deteriorating noticeably. The quality exceeded anything German chemistry had ever produced. Dr. Friedrich Müller, a chemist from IG Farben who was held at Camp Clinton, examined the film stock through a magnifying glass during his projection booth assignments. 3-strip color photography requires coordination and precision that was simply beyond our industrial reach. The chemical stability required for the dyes, the registration of multiple film negatives, each technical step represented years of development we had never achieved. Perhaps nothing shocked us German prisoners more than American musical productions. In May 1944, Camp Hearn screened Yankee Doodle Dandy with James Cagney as George M. Cohan. The patriotic sequences were absolutely spectacular. The energy of the tap-dancing sequences, the way music and story wove together seamlessly. It was entertainment, functioning as ideology, yet performed with such skill that even those of us who wanted to resist found ourselves swept up in it. Feldwebel Hans Richter remarked to me afterward, "We had been told repeatedly that Americans lacked culture. Then we witnessed Yankee Doodle Dandy, hundreds of dancers moving in perfect unison, musical numbers that made you want to march despite your own resistance. Production quality that must have consumed enormous budgets, and this was merely entertainment, not some state ministry production." The musicals revealed something else entirely, something that challenged our understanding of society itself, the integration of different races in American entertainment, however imperfect that integration may have been. When stormy weather arrived at Camp Shelby in June 1944, presenting Bill Robinson and Lena Horne performing as members of an all-black cast at the absolute highest level of artistry, it fundamentally challenged everything we had been taught about racial hierarchies. America certainly possessed its own profound racial problems, that much was evident, yet the very existence of these films, the celebration of black artists and performers, was completely unthinkable in Nazi Germany. Within 2 months of arriving in the camps, the German prisoners had decorated their mess halls with paintings and chandeliers. Christmas ornaments adorned the walls alongside family photographs. These camps had transformed into genuine communities where German cultural traditions mixed with American influences that prisoners absorbed through the films. As autumn 1944 approached, American combat films began arriving at the camps. But these were not films about fighting against Germans. The Special Projects Division made careful decisions about which films to show, deliberately avoiding anything that might breed resentment among the prisoner population. Instead, they selected films depicting the Pacific War, allowing German prisoners to witness American military capability without feeling personally targeted. Guadalcanal Diary showcased American military improvisation and the determination of soldiers. 30 Seconds Over Tokyo demonstrated bombing capabilities that far surpassed anything the Luftwaffe had ever accomplished. Action in the North Atlantic portrayed the merchant marines risking everything to maintain supply lines. Captain Otto von Minden, a U-boat commander imprisoned at Camp Clinton, watched action in the North Atlantic with the professional eye of someone who understood naval warfare. The film demonstrates anti-submarine tactics we never encountered in actual combat. Either this is Hollywood exaggeration, or the Americans possess capabilities we simply didn't know about. Given everything else we have witnessed, I suspect it is the latter. The combat films served an additional purpose beyond mere demonstration of capability. They presented American soldiers as capable of sacrifice and genuine heroism, which helped humanize an enemy we had been taught to despise. German soldiers who had absorbed propaganda about American cowardice watched films depicting individual courage that matched our own military traditions and values. When April 1945 arrived and brought the European war to its conclusion, the most disturbing films German prisoners would ever witness came next. As American forces pushed into German territory and discovered concentration camps, military signal corps personnel filmed the evidence of atrocities. Within just weeks, these films appeared in prisoner camps across America. The footage produced shock, rage, and initially disbelief. Prisoners, struck by the horror of what they saw, began calling them Noxon films, films of bones. Yet gradually many prisoners accepted what the films showed as absolute truth. Following mandatory viewings of atrocity footage, 1,000 prisoners at Camp Butner publicly burned their German uniforms in protest and rejection. At Camp Shelby, when concentration camp footage was shown on May 15th, 1945, the announcement came first. What you are about to witness was filmed by American Signal Corps cameramen. Nothing was staged. No images have been altered. The film ran for 20 minutes. The theater, normally filled with constant murmur and conversation, fell completely silent, except for the sound of prisoners weeping. Some prisoners resisted believing the films initially. At Camp Hearn, several men insisted the footage had been manufactured and faked. Rather than responding with punishment, American authorities presented overwhelming evidence instead. They provided copies of German documents, testimonies from American soldiers who had discovered the camps, additional footage shot at multiple camp locations. The accumulated evidence became impossible to dispute. By June 1945, films had become absolutely central to the massive re-education program underway. Der Ruf was a German-language newspaper published from Fort Kearny in Nebraska during the war years by captured prisoners of war. It was distributed to approximately 140 other POW camps throughout the United States. The publication produced 26 issues during its run as a prisoner newspaper in America. Rather than costing American taxpayers money, Der Ruf actually generated a small profit. The newspaper began featuring film reviews and discussions about what these movies meant for Germany's future and reconstruction. An August 1945 review examined American cinema thoughtfully. These films depict American soldiers returning home, struggling with the transition to peace, questioning whether their sacrifice was worthwhile. That America would create such films, showing doubt and difficulty rather than simple victory celebrations, demonstrates a maturity we must develop. True democracy means presenting truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or difficult. The prisoners selected to work at Fort Kearny as writers and editors came from the intellectual classes, drawn carefully from various camps. These individuals, writers and artists and university professors, were specifically chosen because they held anti-Nazi views. They became film critics, whose reviews influenced how hundreds of thousands of German prisoners understood and interpreted American cinema. Der Ruf's primary mission was redirecting German prisoner focus toward rebuilding their nation and rejecting Nazi ideology entirely. No American director wielded greater influence over German prisoners than Frank Capra. His films, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Meet John Doe, You Can't Take It With You, presented America as simultaneously idealized and self-critical, patriotic yet questioning. Capra had become one of America's most prominent directors during the 1930s, winning 3 Academy Awards for Best Director. His particular vision of American democracy, filtered through Hollywood storytelling, provided the framework through which many German prisoners came to understand American values. George Marshall and President Roosevelt himself recognized that Capra possessed an extraordinary talent for communicating American values to mass audiences. For German prisoners, Capra's films functioned as textbooks in democratic principles, depicting corruption being exposed and overcome by ordinary decency, showing individuals standing against institutional power, and portraying democracy not as some perfect system, but as something perfectible and worth defending. Western films provided an unexpected avenue for ideological transformation. John Ford's Stagecoach, Howard Hawks' Red River, and other westerns presented conceptions of individual freedom, frontier justice, and self-determination that aligned with German military traditions while fundamentally undermining Nazi collectivism. Major Friedrich von Steuben reflected, "The Western hero stands alone, guided by principle, fighting for justice without waiting for orders from command." This represented everything opposite to how we organized our military culture. Yet we found ourselves admiring these characters. They embodied a kind of freedom we had never truly grasped. The Western landscape itself affected us profoundly. Endless spaces stretched across the screen, horizons extending without limitation, a sense of boundless possibility. This contrasted absolutely with the confined and controlled spaces we had known under Nazi rule. These films became windows into both a physical and psychological freedom that German soldiers had never imagined could exist. Prisoners at Camp Shelby began writing their own Western stories, setting them in Germany. They imagined solitary heroes battling authoritarian forces. These narratives revealed the early stirrings of democratic imagination among men trained as soldiers. German prisoners held at Camp Hearn, Texas, included members of a German military orchestra who had brought their instruments with them. They would eventually provide the entertainment that Camp Hearn desperately needed. These musicians began absorbing American musical styles they discovered in the films. Jazz rhythms began appearing in their compositions. Martial music gave way to swing arrangements. Ernst Müller, conductor of the Camp Hearn Orchestra, observed, "The film music demonstrated possibilities we had never considered. The fusion of classical and contemporary forms, the directness of emotional expression, the technical mastery. It was a musical democracy where different styles existed together and enriched one another." By late 1945, prisoner orchestras were performing arrangements based on American film scores. Over the Rainbow from The Wizard of Oz became especially beloved, its words striking deep chords in men separated from their homes and families. American films portrayed women in ways that profoundly unsettled German prisoners, particularly stars like Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, and Joan Crawford, who played intelligent, independent women bearing no resemblance to Nazi conceptions of femininity. Woman of the Year, shown at Camp Clinton in September 1944, featured a female journalist whose career success eclipsed her husband's, something absolutely impossible under Nazi ideology. The presence of women in American films as genuine protagonists, rather than mere ornaments, suggested a society where human capability wasn't restricted by gender. For men raised within an extremely rigid patriarchal system, this was genuinely revolutionary. While some rejected this perspective entirely, many began questioning the restrictions their own wives and daughters endured. American comedies accomplished what no serious propaganda program ever could. They made German prisoners laugh at authority and established power. The Marx Brothers, Abbott and Costello, Bob Hope, these performers dismantled dignity through humor. Duck Soup, screened at Camp Hearn despite official worries about its anti-war message, left German officers laughing at how ridiculous military ceremony and rank could appear. Charlie Chaplin's satirical masterpiece, The Great Dictator, finally reached audiences in October 1945. The response proved complex and deeply personal. Some prisoners recoiled in offense, while others discovered something unexpected, a release of tension they desperately needed. Being able to laugh at the very force that had haunted their nightmares felt somehow liberating. Chaplin's powerful closing monologue, his passionate call for human compassion rather than hatred, resonated deeply. Handwritten copies of those translated words began circulating from barracks to barracks, spreading across the camp network like whispered prayers of hope. Alongside the Hollywood entertainment, camp authorities arranged screenings of American documentaries that revealed the nation's industrial strength and agricultural innovation. Films like The City, The River, and The Plow That Broke the Plains presented American accomplishments with refreshing candor, but equally significant was their willingness to show failures, setbacks, and ongoing struggles. Government-produced documentaries from Washington carried none of the shrill certainty that characterized Nazi propaganda reels. They presented problems and then discussed solutions with reasonable confidence. Dr. Heinrich Bauer, an agricultural expert from East Prussia, found himself captivated by one particular documentary. The screening showed him flooding disasters, soil erosion, crop failures across American farmland, yet simultaneously demonstrated how engineers and farmers were addressing these challenges methodically. Back in Germany, he reflected, such admission of difficulty would never occur publicly. Weakness was something concealed, problems hidden away, perfection performed regardless of reality. This American approach struck him as oddly more convincing than any boasting could be. The Hollywood star system fascinated the German prisoners in ways few anticipated. These actors existed as independent celebrities, untethered to government control or state direction. They selected roles based on preference, negotiated with studios, even dared to criticize the very industries that employed them. Some openly mocked political figures without fear of consequence. To men raised under Nazi authority, this suggested a freedom almost incomprehensible. When word reached the camps that Clark Gable, the handsome leading man, had enlisted as an ordinary private soldier and flown combat missions, the revelation shattered everything prisoners had believed about American celebrity. Learning that James Stewart was piloting bombing runs over German territory reinforced the same jarring truth. American stars weren't sequestered in protected comfort as Nazi propaganda had insisted. They risked their lives alongside ordinary men. Marlene Dietrich presented the most controversial case. This German-born actress had become an American citizen and now entertained American troops across Europe. Her films provoked wildly divided reactions. Some prisoners saw her as a betrayer of her homeland, while others perceived genuine courage in her choices. By Christmas 1945, the cumulative weight of exposure to countless Hollywood productions had accomplished something military defeat alone never could. A complete shift in consciousness spread through the prisoner population. One comprehensive survey of approximately 22,000 German POWs found that three-quarters departed camps with genuine appreciation for democratic principles and positive feelings toward their American captors. Only 1 in 10 maintained militant Nazi conviction. The Special Projects Division made note of their discovery in official reports, concluding that motion pictures had proven themselves the most powerful instrument available for communicating American values. Films succeeded where lectures, textbooks, and philosophical discussions had failed. They allowed prisoners to experience American democracy emotionally, rather than merely absorb it as intellectual information. Following repatriation, Anders and Richter, along with fellow former prisoners, established a newspaper back in Germany, reviving the name Der Ruth. This publication grew to reach 100,000 readers regularly. Many of these former POWs would eventually help create Group 47, a literary movement that shaped German culture for the following decades. Christmas 1945 marked the crescendo of the film program's influence. Camp officials arranged special holiday screenings featuring motion pictures like Going My Way and Holiday Inn, films depicting American celebrations and cultural traditions. At Camp Herne, thousands of German prisoners gathered to watch these windows into ordinary American existence, with its mixture of aspiration and hardship. The technical brilliance was undeniable, from elaborate musical sequences to sophisticated cinematography, to the precise emotional architecture constructed through editing and orchestral accompaniment. These productions showcased American filmmaking excellence. Yet what truly penetrated the prisoner's consciousness was the fundamental humanity radiating from the screen, depicting communities capable of celebrating both profound joy and quiet domestic contentment. As German prisoners began departing for home throughout 1946, they carried something intangible but transformative: memories of American films that would guide Germany's rebuilding efforts. Numerous men would eventually occupy significant roles in West German life, carrying forward the lessons absorbed in darkened camp theaters. International treaties, specifically the Geneva Conventions, guaranteed that prisoners would receive provisions and medical treatment equivalent to that provided to American servicemen. Yet the American military offered something beyond these formal obligations: an education in culture that would fundamentally reshape how Germany developed democratically. The impact transcended the leadership class entirely. Ordinary enlisted men and lower-ranking soldiers returned home carrying altered perceptions. They had witnessed racial integration depicted naturally in American musicals. They had observed female independence portrayed in romantic comedies as something normal and desirable. They had seen workers treated with dignity in serious dramatic productions. These images couldn't be erased from memory or unseen. American motion pictures didn't simply transform the prisoners themselves. The prisoners' reactions prompted Americans to reconsider cultural diplomacy's potential. Success of the film initiative influenced how American military planners approached occupation policy, resulting in the creation of America Houses, cultural centers established throughout Germany where citizens could access American films and cultural materials. The Motion Picture Export Association, recognizing how profoundly cinema had affected POW attitudes, advocated aggressively for expanded distribution of American films in the post-war German market. By 1950, American productions dominated German cinema screens, continuing and accelerating the cultural transformation that had begun behind barbed wire. 40 years later, in 1985, surviving former prisoners gathered at Camp Herne to commemorate the war's conclusion. More than 300 men returned, many accompanied by their children and grandchildren, eager to witness the location where their personal metamorphosis had originated. Former Obergefreiter Hans Müller, now a film distributor based in Hamburg, addressed the assembled crowd. He spoke of arriving as an adversary, as a committed Nazi, as someone thoroughly convinced of racial and cultural supremacy. He left, he explained, as someone's friend, as a believer in democratic governance, as a man who had glimpsed through cinema a profoundly different existence. The reunion featured showings of films screened 4 decades previous. Mrs. Miniver, Why We Fight, and Casablanca flickered across the same camp theatre screen. Former enemies, now allies, sat together, Americans and Germans united in shared recognition of cinema's power to transform hearts and minds. Former Hauptmann Wilhelm Richter delivered the central address. He described how Hollywood had provided something no military triumph could supply, a tangible vision of transformation and becoming. The prisoners had observed American films not as flawless perfection, but as possibility, not as hollow propaganda, but as dreams rendered visible and achievable. The films had taught that authentic strength emerged from embracing diversity, that genuine prosperity flowered in freedom's soil, that culture thrived when liberated from state apparatus control. The scale and structure of the film program across German POW camps reveals just how methodical and comprehensive the operation truly was. Projection equipment appeared in more than 380 camps. Approximately 4 films screened weekly at each facility, distributed by the Army Motion Picture Service on 16mm film stock. Thousands of titles circulated among all camps throughout the 1943 to 1946 period. The cumulative viewership reached staggering numbers, with individual prisoners watching between 150 and 200 films during their captivity. The selection encompassed remarkable diversity, everything from contemporary Hollywood releases to classic films, documentaries, alongside entertainment productions. Thousands of prisoners enrolled in film discussion groups and analysis circles. Camp publications printed extensive film reviews and critical commentary. Many kept detailed personal records documenting every film they viewed. Their decisions about post-war careers were shaped by these cinematic exposures. Subsequent psychological research demonstrated how profoundly Hollywood cinema had affected German prisoners' consciousness development. Commercial cinema achieved deeper psychological transformation than traditional education programs could manage. Films navigated around intellectual barriers, reaching directly into the emotional and ideological centers of the human mind. Multiple pathways through which films accomplished this transformation became evident upon analysis. They created emotional attachment to American characters. They demonstrated functioning alternative social arrangements. They presented prosperity achieved without military conquest. They portrayed individual liberty as providing genuine strength rather than dangerous chaos. Entertainment production generated positive associations with American culture that deliberate propaganda could never accomplish. Different film genres wielded distinct psychological effects upon viewers. Musicals communicated infectious joy and vitality, undermining German stereotypes about American superficiality. Westerns depicted frontier individualism that resonated with military honor codes while simultaneously challenging collectivist ideology. Comedies proved that authority could become subject to mockery without triggering social collapse. Serious, dramatic productions displayed psychological and moral complexity rivaling the greatest European art cinema. War films portrayed American soldiers with humanity while resisting the temptation to demonize enemy combatants. Each genre delivered implicit ideological messages that accumulated across hundreds of screenings, forged comprehensive worldview transformation. The sheer range itself suggested a pluralistic culture operating according to fundamentally different principles than Nazi uniformity demanded. American films provided practical technical instruction that proved valuable for Germany's post-war development. Prisoners studied cinematography, sound recording, color technology, special effects creation, and distribution methodology. This technical knowledge later enabled employment in cinema-related industries. Many former POWs brought American production methods back to Germany, modernizing the German film industry throughout the 1950s, using techniques absorbed through watching Hollywood productions. Films communicated democratic principles not through political rhetoric, but through narrative architecture itself. Standard Hollywood storytelling emphasized individual initiative, social advancement through personal effort, criticism and gradual institutional reform, coexistence of competing values, and personal redemption through growth and change. Repeated across hundreds of motion pictures, these narrative structures created entirely new frameworks for understanding society and human possibility. Motion pictures inadvertently provided economic instruction as well. Prisoners observed consumer culture operating, labor relationships developing organically, entrepreneurship being pursued, market mechanisms functioning independent of government direction, and financial systems operating according to their own internal logic. This economic education proved invaluable when prisoners returned to help reconstruct Germany's shattered economy. Many later credited American films with fundamental insights into market dynamics that would fuel West Germany's post-war economic expansion. The influence extended far beyond the prisoners' internment period. Former prisoners advanced into positions of political authority, bringing democratic values into German governance. Educators established American studies programs in universities. Business entrepreneurs applied American capitalist methods. Cultural workers created German films bearing Hollywood's influence. Social activists championed reforms inspired by American social cinema. The transformation proved so thorough that within 5 years of war's end, West Germany emerged as America's most dependable European ally. This dramatic reversal from bitter enemy to steadfast partner owed considerable debt to cultural preparation conducted through cinema. Historians now characterize the film program as one of the most successful soft power operations ever undertaken. Accomplished without coercion, devoid of crude propaganda, transforming adversary consciousness through commercial entertainment alone. German prisoners inhabited barracks accommodating 50 men per building. 5 barracks shared communal mess facilities staffed with cooks and servers, equipped with proper silverware, and by available accounts serving genuinely excellent food. Beyond such physical amenities, they experienced cultural exposure that rewired their fundamental outlook. The program succeeded because it avoided confrontation and relied instead on attraction. Films never commanded prisoners what conclusions to reach, but demonstrated alternative ways of perceiving and interpreting reality. Entertainment became education. Narratives became vehicles for ideological transformation. Cinematic dreams became the architecture of political change. On April 15, 1946, the final group of German prisoners at Camp Herne prepared for repatriation to their homeland. The last film shown was The Best Years of Our Lives, which followed American servicemen navigating the complicated transition to peacetime, presenting an honest portrait of difficulties that spoke directly to men facing their own uncertain homecoming. As final credits appeared and theater lights came up for the last time in Camp Herne's projection room, German prisoners filed out. No longer the Nazi soldiers who had arrived 3 years earlier. They had been exposed, instructed, and fundamentally converted simply through the act of watching motion pictures. Their experience testifies to culture's dominance over ideology, to soft power's superiority compared to military force, to the enduring reality that the most transformative weapon frequently isn't destructive, but narrative. German prisoners had arrived in America anticipating a fractured, weakened nation. Instead, through Hollywood's perspective, they encountered a civilization sufficiently self-assured to examine its own shortcomings honestly, wealthy enough to dedicate resources purely to artistic entertainment, and sophisticated enough to craft art transcending propagandistic intention. They had experienced American films and remained forever altered by that encounter. Within their transformation lay the foundation for lasting alliance, economic reconstruction programs, and democratic rebuilding of an entire nation. They had witnessed democracy performed across movie screens, and they spent their remaining years pursuing in reality what cinema had revealed in imaginative possibility.